Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Today, I'll be joined by an old friend of Dialogue, a British scholar, Martin Jakes. His former senior fellow at the Department of Politics and International Studies at Cambridge University. We have a lot to cover today. The rapidly evolving situation in Afghanistan, the rivalry between China and the United States, and the still ravaging COVID-19 pandemic, and the questions about its origin. These are our topics. I'm Wang Guan. Over the past weeks, Taliban forces have taken control of Afghan territories at lightning speed. They have seized the presidential palace in Kabul as President Ghani fled the country. The Taliban's capture of Kabul, and indeed of the whole country, has been relatively peaceful as they have not encountered much resistance. So, Martin, let me go to you and pick your brain on this very important question. It is a fluid situation there, and it seems everyone grossly underestimated just how quickly the country would fall to the Taliban and why it would fall to the Taliban. What do you make of what's happening in the past 24 and 48 hours?
Well, obviously, this has been an extraordinary situation. And what I think it reveals is really how extraordinary little support the United States actually enjoyed in Afghanistan, and likewise, of course, effectively its puppet government. I mean, you know, it collapsed like a house of cards, so 20 years, basically, for 20 years, American military force has held the country in this position. And once the opportunity arose for the Taliban to resume ruling the country, that is what has happened. And I think the other side of the coin to this, you know, is that it's clear the Taliban does enjoy considerable support in Afghanistan. And we shouldn't be surprised by that. It's obvious that that was the situation before, and it's the situation now.
Well, let's talk about the immediate cause, if you will, of this, Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. Former President Donald Trump criticized Joe Biden of being weak, calling the fall of Afghanistan one of the worst defeats in the U.S. history. Do you blame Biden and his announcement of the complete U.S. troops withdrawal?
Well, I think that it's difficult to really simply blame Biden for the situation. I mean, this has been long in the making. I mean, it ought to have been obvious to successive American presidents, starting, of course, with the person who has prime responsibility, George W. Bush. It was during his presidency that this all started. And all of them, there must have been plenty of evidence for Obama and for Trump, and now, of course, Biden, that this war wasn't working. But the truth is that no president had the courage to do something about it. You have to go back to 9/11 and the mood in America, and the looking back on it now, although I personally felt this at the time, the extraordinary overreaction of the United States. First, Afghanistan, secondly, Iraq, to, let's put the thing in context. I mean, Twin Towers was a disaster for America, but it was only 2,500 people who died. And yet America's reaction was to create chaos, effectively, and many, many deaths in these two countries.
Yeah, indeed. 20 years in Afghanistan, over $2 trillion spent, and hundreds of thousands of lives, primarily Afghans, being lost. What are the biggest takeaways, the biggest lessons from the U.S. military intervention in Afghanistan?
Well, I think that this period of 20 years since it all started has been an absolute disaster in terms of American political and military leadership. I mean, they absolutely squandered the position that they had. by simply misreading it. A fundamental misreading of the world 20 years ago in believing that American unipolar world would survive indefinitely, and America and this century would belong to the United States. This was the neoconservative orthodoxy, and it was to some extent consensual position in America, and it was completely wrong. It was a total misreading of what was happening in the world. I mean, the world is unrecognizable today from how they thought it would be then. And I think that this is very, very concerning for the United States because, their leadership, the leadership they've shown, the way they have related to the world over the past 20 years has been a huge mistake, an error of massive proportions, which has greatly reduced respect for the United States, undermined faith in America and America's word, made it much more likely that allies will not, previous allies or present allies will support America in the way that they might have done otherwise, and you certainly used to do. So I think that this is a great, this era is a great turning point. America can never be the same again, and can never be viewed, right, and can never be viewed again in the same way by the rest of the world.
So, Martin, do you think, given what's happening in Afghanistan, this will be a lessons learned for America's ruling elites? After seeing all this, they will get to understand the limits of American interventionism.
It's impossible for them not to at least acknowledge and hopefully learn from that question, from what's gone wrong, because it has been such a disastrous period in American history that I think that they will be more cautious about intervening. And the fact of the matter is, of course, that the worst periods of intervention were some time ago. I mean, that the actual initiative which led to it. And it's been less true with Obama and also, interestingly, with Trump. But Obama, of course, did wobble around over Syria and did make a major mistake over Libya. But I think that probably America will be now more cautious. I mean, Trump's position was different altogether. Trump didn't really believe, he had a different foreign policy, not just towards China, but also towards American intervention. He thought America, to some extent, should retreat into America, unlike the consensual position since 1945, which was America should run the world. So we'll see what happens. I mean, which way things move. But I think that this is so humiliating for the United States that they're likely to be very cautious about getting their hands burnt again.
But Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, seems to have assigned blame to Joe Biden earlier in the day when he was interviewed on the situation of Afghanistan. He said, the sudden troops withdrawal announced by Biden contributed to the situation there. Do you think the cross-Atlantic solidarity will be there? Will all Western countries, led by the U.S., be on the same page when recognizing the legitimacy of a future Taliban-led government?
Interesting question. I think that Johnson, remember, was really, his man was Trump and not Biden. And he still got, and it's interesting, his reaction is to blame Biden. I mean, I think Biden, at the end of the day, he didn't do it well, but at least he had the guts to get out and, call a spade, as it were. The fact that it would have been very difficult to dress this situation up however they came out, actually, to be quite frank about it. All these people who are criticizing Biden, it was all done prematurely and so on. Come on now, these American generals should own up to the fact that this was a disaster and they were party to this disaster. So you can't heap all the blame on Biden when what Biden's done this year, when in fact it's 20 years in the making, in the creation. How other Western governments will react? I think probably they'll tend to move together on this. I mean, there'll be outliers and so on. The German government's position on things is always the most interesting in Europe, I think, usually the best of what we got. And we'll have to see.
So talking about the situation in Afghanistan, how do you think, the reemergence of the Taliban will impact Joe Biden's political future in 2024 and also his Democratic Party's chances at the midterm elections in a year from now?
Well, I think this is going to be a big problem for Biden. As we know, Biden is won the presidency in the context of the 4 years of Trump. And there's this huge cleavage now in American politics because basically the Republican Party is has been captured by Trump. And we've got the congressional elections next year. I mean, there must be a strong chance anyway, before all this, that the Democrats would lose one of the two houses in these elections. And once that happens, then it'll be much more difficult, as we know in American politics, for a president to carry through in Biden's case, particularly the economic program, ambitious economic program that he has got. And then further into the future, I mean, we're only 3 years away from the next presidential election. Could we see the return of Trump? Could we see, if not the return of Trump, someone who is essentially Trumpian in their outlook? So I think that one of the biggest doubts and most worrying elements of the situation in the world today is where America is going. And I think that American democracy is not safe. I think there's a lot of doubt surrounding that, and all the things that were said right at the end of Trump are true and haven't gone away, even though they're not being discussed with the same anxiety and urgency as they were then.
China has also spoken about the situation in Afghanistan. You may remember Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi met with the Taliban leader in Tianjin not so long ago. What do you make of China's position towards the Taliban?
Well, I think that the Chinese position is, I broadly concur with it. I mean, it seems to me that China can see that the Taliban is overwhelmingly the most important representative political organization in Afghanistan, and that it will be very important for China to have a positive relationship with the new government, and it will be encouraging that new government to be inclusive, because the last thing China wants to see is elements of a civil war in Afghanistan, and also it doesn't want to see, which also would lend would create the possibility of more terrorists operating within Afghanistan, and that would probably have implications for China in the context of Xinjiang. So I think that China will be very anxious to develop a positive dialogue with the Taliban, and it seems to me that started probably some time ago anyway. So I think that's the right approach.
Let's shift gears a little bit, Martin, and talk about China-US rivalry, which seems to have been escalating ever since we last met, in a world particularly now battered by COVID-19 and this Delta variant. The U.S. has been trying to unite its allies against China and, forming old ties in Southeast Asia, as it had ignored during the previous administration. And adding on to that is, of course, the raging pandemic that presents a new propaganda battlefield, if you will, as the U.S. is now heavily pursuing the lab leak theory there. You once expressed that the West is getting back to the old Cold War attitude. Do you think it is getting worse in the past year, and will anything stop it?
I don't think it's got worse over the last year. I think that the height of this was last year so far, in 2020, because Trump was absolutely toxic, poisonous in the tech war and so on. I think that the sort of extremity, if you like, of Trump has given way to something not dissimilar, but much more considered and much less raucous on the part of Biden. But the fact of the matter is that we are now in a very different situation to the one we were in before 2016 and the election of Trump. And that is, in America, the whole, basically, the consensual position, it's bipartisan, but it's more than bipartisan, it's consensual view of China, which it is now regards it to be a threat to its position as the global hegemon. That is what underlies the great shift in American attitudes towards China. Before 2016, they didn't think that. Now they do think that. And this, therefore, is the beginning of a long period, in my view, of a fairly conflictual relationship between the two countries.
Yeah, there are many who argue that the U.S.-China rivalry will never get to a point where the USSR and the U.S. got during the height of the Cold War, because of the interconnectedness of U.S.-China in terms of trade and economic links. Do you share that optimism?
Yeah, I think it's wrong to call this a Cold War. I mean, there are elements certainly in the attitudes in the United States of that Cold War period. There's no doubt about that. So therefore, you can see, part of what we're witnessing is the return of a Cold War mentality on the part of the United States. But that does not mean that it is a Cold War. I think it's very different. The relationship is so different. I mean, America was always much stronger than the Soviet Union. The two countries lived in total isolation from each other in their own blocks, their military blocks and their economic blocks, and it was characterized by deep military rivalry. The arms race, nuclear weapons, Cuban Missile Crisis, the Berlin War, the Berlin situation, and so on. So this is very different. That era was very different from this one. I don't expect there to be that, sort of fundamental decoupling resulting eventually in the cleavage between the two countries, so they live, as in the pattern of the Cold War, in two very different universes. I don't think that is going to happen. I think that what we're going to witness is of course, across a broad front, quite an acrimonious relationship between the two countries. Everything's contested, everything's made difficult. There'll be, but primarily, I think it'll reduce itself, in particular, for example, the decoupling, to high-level tech, basically, though semiconductors and so on. The fear about Huawei and the rest of it, and a sort of race, if you like, in the kind of commanding height of high tech. But it won't just be that. I think that what we're witnessing is something different in general, and that is, this is a contest between China and the United States for which modernity, the Chinese modernity or American modernity, will be most appropriate, most relevant, most successful in the 21st century. And that is not confined to one field. High tech is extremely important, but it's not just about that. Think about inclusivity. It's about the quality of governance, extremely important, the quality of leadership. It's about the resilience of societies. This is what we've seen, for example, in the context of the pandemic. So I think this is a very broad contest, and I would add this, and that is that, remember, the Cold War started with America actually going through a very creative phase, and on top of the world and dominant. And this change now, since 2016, takes place in a totally different context. America has been in decline since 1980, but especially since 2008. China has been on the rise ever since 1978. That's a very different context to the Cold War.
Another point of great contention is COVID and its origins. What do you make of Joe Biden's insistence, asking its intelligence community to find the origin of COVID-19 and particularly probing a lab leak theory from China?
Well, look, you see, COVID emerged in the context of America's assault on China and Trump. And so from the word go, COVID was, so that we've got a reservoir of vaccines, unused vaccines in this country. And we'll be sending a few of them. This is, I'm a commentary on the attitude of the West, a really serious problem for the West, because the future, in my view, lies with the developing world. And China's relationship with the developing world is an acknowledgement of that this is the new axis of the future.
Martin Jakes, always great to pick your brain. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
And that will do it for this edition of Dialogue. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. Thank you for watching.